sensing a hush has come over the room, so maybe we should move on with the program. Well, thank you everybody for coming to this final session of the symposium. My name is Ryan Thomas, and I'm an assistant professor of journalism studies in the Missouri School of Journalism, and we have three excellent panelists for this panel on student press issues. I'm going to give a quick introduction to our panelists, who will each speak for around 8 to 10 minutes, and then I'll open things up for questions. Just by way of introduction, going down the line here, Vincent Filak is a professor of journalism at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh, where he also serves as the advisor to the Advanced Titan, the campus student weekly newspaper. He was previously an associate professor of journalism at Ball State University, where he served as the advisor to the multi-award-winning Ball State Daily News. He has also published a number of journal articles about student press issues, in addition to his research on newsroom convergence and social psychology. Jonathan Peters is an assistant professor of journalism at the University of Kansas, where he specializes in First Amendment law and media policy. He is the press freedom correspondent for the Columbia Journalism Review and has written about press freedom and free expression issues for the Harvard Law and Policy Review, Esquire, The Atlantic, Slate, Wired, The Nation, and PBS. He is also a volunteer attorney for the Student Press Law Center and the American Civil Liberties Union, specializing in First Amendment cases. His research examines the intersection of new media and the law. Last but by no means least, Frank Lomonte is the executive director of the Student Press Law Center, having joined them in 2008 after practicing law in Atlanta and clerking for federal judges on the Northern District of Georgia and the 11th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Before law school, he was an award-winning investigative journalist and political columnist for daily newspapers in Florida and Georgia. His articles about the First Amendment and media law topics have been widely published in Education Week, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the American University Law Review, the University of North Carolina First Amendment Law Review, and in many other outlets. He is also an adjunct professor for the law and journalism schools at the University of Georgia. I believe that Jonathan will be speaking first, so I'll turn it over to him.
All right, thank you, Ryan, and it's fun to be back at my alma mater, and I apologize for coming back as a Kansas Jayhawk. I never intended to do that. And I should also mention that the last time I was here, it actually ended disastrously. I was here to speak at the Missouri Law Review Symposium back in 2014, and this was in January. We had an ice storm come in that night. I don't know if any of you were here or remember that. And afterward, there was a reception. Yeah, Ben remembers this. He and I were on a panel together. There was a reception back at RJI. I go there. I promise I have only one drink. I don't leave there after having 8 or 9, although that is my usual. But we leave, and on my way out, a friend of mine slew-foots me from behind when he hits an icy patch. I go flying. I tear part of my rotator cuff and break my arm. So that is easily the most electrifying law symposium experience I've ever had. I hope not to repeat that today. So I want to begin with a few remarks about public high school law, and then it will become clear in a moment why I'm beginning here and then pivoting into the law of the college student press. So public high schools for decades have had a fitful relationship with free expression. One school expelled students who refused to salute the American flag at school. Another suspended students who wore armbands at school to protest the Vietnam War. One suspended a student who made sexual references in a school speech. Many have banned books from their libraries and their curricular reading list. And some have suspended students who use their personal off-campus computers and social media platforms to criticize teachers and administrators. The courts have been active in this area, and today it is well-settled First Amendment law that public school students generally do not have the same free speech rights that an adult in a non-school setting would have. Every year brings new disputes in this area, and many of them involve the student press. No doubt, tensions between high school journalists and administrators date back to the very first time that Central High USA was written about in a manner that suggested that it was not the very best public high school in the country. So lots of student papers exist at the mercy of the school boards that fund them, just as many grown-up papers exist at the mercy of the publishers or ownership groups that fund them. They all live with somebody looking over their shoulders. And for public high school journalists, that reality stems from the 1988 U.S. Supreme Court case, Hazelwood v. Kohlmeyer. And it held that a public high school paper produced as part of a class, in the absence of a policy or practice declaring that paper a forum for student expression, could be censored as long as the censorship is viewpoint neutral and administrators show a reasonable educational justification for the censorship. Since then, schools have used Hazelwood to justify all manner of speech restraints in public schools. And I bring that up because when Hazelwood was handed down, it was unclear from the decision whether it did or should apply in the post-secondary context. There is a frequently cited footnote from Justice White who said that the court, quote, need not now decide whether the same degree of deference is appropriate with respect to school-sponsored expressive activities at the college and university level, end quote. At the time, as Frank and I wrote in a piece for The Atlantic a few years ago, First Amendment scholars thought that the decision's damage would be limited to primary and secondary education. And they thought that because the majority opinion rested on essentially two justifications for the speech restraint at issue in Hazelwood. One is what has come to be known as the maturity rationale, which says that you restrict speech in this context so that vulnerable student listeners won't be harmed. And then the disassociation rationale, which says that schools should be free to disown speech that associates the school with controversial views. So neither of those rationales seem to upset the long-held judicial disfavor for speech restraints in the college context. First, colleges are gathering places for the individual expression of ideas. And so it would seem that they would have little need to disassociate themselves from individual speakers' ideas, on the theory that reasonable listeners would not ascribe to the college or university the ideas of an individual speaker. Plus the doctrine of academic freedom, which has little recognition at the K through 12 level, but is much more widely recognized at the college level, would protect the sanctity of the college campus as a place where unconventional speech typically is welcome to the extent that it's educational. And then second, Hazelwood's level of control seemed to many at the time to be more justifiable in the captive audience context of a K through 12 school, where attendance up to a certain age is compulsory. And offended listeners, as a result of the compulsion, wouldn't be able to disengage as easily or as fully from the speech. The interest of the school, the speaker, and the listener balance out differently when the audience is made up of adults who are free to leave and who are free to counterspeak in more generous ways. So it was on those bases that many First Amendment scholars took comfort in 1988 that Hazelwood simply wouldn't go to college. And since then, we have seen that comfort level was largely misplaced. Today, 4 federal circuits have explicitly embraced Hazelwood as the standard by which all student speech, even that of adult post-secondary students, should be judged in a curricular setting or with regard to school-sponsored speech. Only one federal circuit, the First Circuit, has explicitly rejected Hazelwood's application in the college environment. So putting aside any points of law, I think that's simply bad policy. Ours is a journalism industry in which the production and distribution of news is widely dispersed, and the traditional media have been and still are today reinventing themselves to survive in an environment where newspapers, long the source of community-oriented and investigative reporting, continue to lose their financial footing. So students are playing a more vital role today than ever before in filling in some of the gaps created by those erosions. Just a couple of examples. So campus-based publications and collaborations between students and professionals are varied, and you can find them all over the country. You can find them here at the University of Missouri, at my school now, the University of Kansas. We both have state house-oriented reporting programs that enable students to go to the State House to do reporting and then have their work distributed by a lot of different state and local media. Arizona State University operates its own news service, the Cronkite News Service, that does something similar. Ohio University has It is a paid internship program that enables its journalism students to go to Columbus, Ohio and report from its State House and have reporting distributed by the AP and or by the Columbus Dispatch. So on top of that, nearly every university in the country is home to a student paper that covers campus and some local affairs, many of which have an impact far beyond campus borders. And for years, too, there has been a growing consensus that journalism programs need to transform themselves into better news producers. So I'll give you just 3 examples here. These are conclusions and recommendations from different types of organizations about the extent to which a university ought to be a news producer. So back in 2010, there was a report on democracy in the digital age that was from the Knight Commission on the Information Needs of Communities in a Democracy. And among other things, it concluded that universities needed to enhance their roles as, quote, hubs of journalistic activity, end quote. And then in a 2011 report on 21st century journalism, the New America Foundation challenged journalism programs to become, quote, anchor institutions involved in the production of community relevant news, end quote. And then in a 2011 report as well, this is on the changing media landscape, the FCC said that foundations should fund, quote, journalism school residencies for recent graduates to manage efforts to produce significant journalism for the community using journalism students, end quote. So, I would basically at this point kiss on the mouth any of the schools that already have taken steps to produce journalism like that, journalism that mirrors society, that plays a watchdog role, that monitors power, holds people responsible, and so on. That kind of reporting serves democracy. And I hope that more schools take steps in that direction. But here is the problem. As college students and collegiate journalism programs are playing an increasing role in producing that kind of news and information, the federal courts are curtailing their First Amendment freedoms to do so. And so I would say that a major collision is not far off, and Hazelwood is a major driver in that collision. So just to remind you, 4 federal circuits have adopted Hazelwood at the college level. 1 has rejected it. The rest have yet to take up the issue. So whatever the debatable merits of Hazelwood's application at the K through 12 level, I think it's unwise, even dangerous, to apply Hazelwood at the college level. We simply can't afford to live in a society where free speech on college campuses can be so easily limited. Not when college students and faculty members are playing a growing role in meeting the news needs of their communities. At times, fulfilling those needs means candidly covering a range of public issues that might draw the ire of university administrators or benefactors. And unlike news produced by an independent outlet or a professional outlet, news produced by a school-sponsored outlet or within some kind of curricular journalism program is vulnerable to Hazelwood censorship. Among other things, the case says that schools may censor speech that, quote, associates the school with any position other than neutrality on matters of political controversy, end quote. That is plainly irreconcilable with watchdog journalism, which, of course, is a necessary ingredient of having an informed community. In addition, I would argue that students learn the most when they have to make their own editorial decisions away from the school's long shadow. And that means they have to decide for themselves what to print, how to edit for clarity, how to resolve ethical conflicts, and they have to take responsibility for every one of those decisions. That journalistic process, by definition, is challenging. But I also think that it engages students with the corresponding challenges of self-government and with the role that journalism is ideally supposed to play in democracy. So I would conclude here by saying that if we want college students and journalism programs to be engaged and to continue making the contributions that they already are making, then the federal courts need to stop curtailing their First Amendment freedoms in the context of Hazelwood. So more specifically, what might we do? We could look to the 1969 case, Tinker v. Des Moines, and use that, which is a much more speech protective standard than that of Hazelwood. And at the same time, Tinker also recognizes that schools have a proper role to play in creating an environment that is conducive to learning. And then the other thing that states can do, legislatures can do, and some already have, and many are actually working on this now, in a campaign that the Student Press Law Center, with Frank's leadership, is trying to get done, is get laws passed around the country that provide one, that say Hazelwood is not the appropriate standard to apply in the college environment for the colleges and universities in the public arena, and then for private colleges and universities to say, even though you're private and theoretically you could do what you want, you are going to play by the rules of a public university. So you will apply the Tinker standard. So with all of that said, I'll conclude with a line that Frank and I had in this Atlantic piece. Ann Richards is famously credited with the line that Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in high heels. So I think that in some ways could be applied today to college journalists who are being asked to fulfill community needs for professional quality news without the assurances that keep professionals safe when their work provokes a backlash. And I think that they deserve better than that. So thank you.
Good afternoon, and my name is Vince Filak, and I'm here. It really is an honor to be back, so thank you very much, sir, for sponsoring this, and thank you all for inviting me to speak. This was my doctoral alma mater. My first visit to Mizzou came about 20 years ago when I applied for a job as a city editor at the Columbia Missourian. The venerable journalist George Kennedy was going to be my boss. He never said anything to me the whole walk to lunch. He sat me down, and I remember his immortal words, which were, "I have 4 people for this job, and everybody's more qualified than you are." So that got me off to a flying start here at Mizzou. He gave me the job, and thanks to that, I was able to spend a lot of time getting to know a lot more about Georgia and a lot more about free press. And that landed me my first tenure track job at Ball State, where I got to advise the student newspaper. And I really kind of developed a passion for understanding how letting students run their own show, like John says. You take the risks, you get the kudos, you take the responsibility, and you deal with the backlash. But what I also found out was, unfortunately, Ball State was kind of a rare bird in that case. In many cases, not enough people had those rights and those responsibilities. I found a lot of colleagues at different institutions who found themselves in very precarious positions due to ham-handed administrators, overly zealous faculty, or the ever-popular concerned citizens who decided that the restriction of free expression was in their bailiwick. What I'd like to do today, John did a great job of explaining how these kinds of issues work in kind of a legal matter in terms of the censorship that we all seem to know, administrators overreaching. But I'd also like to talk a little bit more about the other ways in which censorship can be an effective deterrent to free speech, including one that I've studied quite a bit, which is the willingness to self-censor within your own self. Now, in terms of just basic censorship, I think what I'd like to explain is that I view censorship in a very broad case. My idea of censorship is that anytime somebody is trying unfairly to prevent someone else from providing a message to the public, that fits the model of censorship. And there are a variety of ways in which that has been done. Again, prior restraint, prior review, administrative overreach. But there are other forms that I think get overlooked and unfortunately get kind of bypassed on our way towards seeing how the speech rights of students have shrunk. The first of which is, of course, the threat and punishment censorship, because one of the best ways to prevent people from doing something is to threaten them. And many school administrators, both at the high school and college levels, have done just that. You kill off dissenting voices or otherwise bothersome voices by threatening to punish them. One of the favorites of administrators, especially on the college level, is to threaten to fire the advisor. Wayne State College in Nebraska this year dismissed not only 1, but 2 faculty media advisors this year. One was the case of Max McElwain, who was known to support free press and push for investigative reporting at the student newspaper. The paper ran articles in 2015, 2016 that were very critical of the administration's financial management of the school. In 2015, the Matador at St. Gabriel High School in California was censored, and its advisor was suspended when it tried to report on the dismissal of a teacher. That advisor was eventually reinstated, but had a written reprimand placed in her file. Threats are common because there's always a threat to shut down the paper or remove an advisor. It's the old, we're going to put this in your permanent record kind of threat that happens to dissuade people from speaking out. The second manner, of course, is financial censorship. Traditional media models for professional news organizations rely very heavily on advertising and subscriptions to base their news operation. College operations, and dare I say high school ones, tend not to model that way because they need additional funding. The advertising itself isn't supportive enough, and although that funding is supposed to come with no strings attached, that's not always the case. The student government at the University of Kansas, for example, cut the Daily Kansans funding in half in 2015 after the paper had previously published editorials critical of the student election system. Student Senate members openly acknowledged that there was, quote, problematic coverage of the student government on their campus, and that was an impetus towards the reduction of funding. At Wesleyan University last year, the student government threatened to revoke the Wesleyan Argus's funding after the paper had published an opinion piece critical of the Black Lives Matter movement. It then followed through with that and revoked the Argus's funding after the paper ran an editorial outlining how budgetary threats by that government should not be used to censor the paper. So they kind of got it both ways. Too many universities and high schools, I think, see student media as needing to be about 95% public relations and about 5% Kardashian coverage for anybody to view it as a good publication. And unfortunately, when that's not the case, that's when the funds get cut. The third type, and I think it's an unfortunately common type, is what I call theft censorship. One of the more classic forms of keeping people from seeing a publication is to steal it. Dozens of theft cases are reported to SPLC every year in order to suppress the message. Now, this is patently stupid in my mind for two reasons. One is most publications have an internet presence, so stealing the press run from getting people to get the news makes about as much sense as trying to catch sand in a sifter. And the second thing is that the minute somebody tries to censor something is the minute more people start paying attention to it. In my mind, it's about as stupid as wandering into a dark room, smelling gas, and saying, I'm going to light a match to see what's going on in here. People don't get it, but they keep stealing and destroying news. In March, 4,500 copies of the Chanticleer at the Coastal Carolina University disappeared after that paper published an article about fraternities that turned out to have some incorrect information in it. 3 other publications in April had similar thefts after they were similarly critical. Now, my time at Ball State, we experienced this firsthand when we published an article about the arrest of the women's goalkeeper on the soccer team. About a third of our press run disappeared, and witnesses noted that, quote, young women dressed in black Ball State athletic apparel, end quote, were seen loading copies of our paper into duffel bags. Police, oddly enough, were unable to locate them. Instead of complaining, we took a very different tack. We took that Friday paper and we republished it entirely in our Monday issue as an insert. We also addressed the theft in the reprint with an editorial we titled, Nice Try, We're Still Here. Now, in spite of all of these scary things and these consequences, I think the biggest thing that I found is the greatest threat to what we have is the concept of self-censorship. About 10 years ago, I began reviewing this concept by finding some work that Andrew Hayes and his colleagues had done at Ohio State. And what they found is that self-censorship is an intrinsic trait modulated by whether or not that person was willing to express an opinion in a hostile or friendly climate. Now, furthermore, the studies found that this trait was both measurable and individual. And what that meant was that people who scored higher on the willingness to self-censor scale were among the most likely to censor themselves, especially if they found themselves in an opinion that was in the minority or that they would receive outside negative affect. My work in media has found basically a bunch of different things with this, but I'll boil it down to 3 simple things as far as high school and college media are concluded. One, the more controversial a person perceives the topic to be, the less they want to cover it, even if they know it's important to the readership. The higher the person rated on that willingness to self-censor scale, the less comfortable they felt about that topic and the less likely they were to run anything about it. And even though we account for things like fear of reprimand, joy at work, and other mitigating factors, self-censorship was one of the strongest predictors whether or not somebody would speak out or not, or whether or not something would be covered. So in conclusion, this all leads me to some very concerning thoughts. First of all, self-censorship is probably a major concern for media professionals and those of us working with student journalists because it's almost impossible to flag as an advocate because we lack the ability to see it in the same way we see traditional censoring actions or administrative outreach. I can't know what you're thinking when you decide not to run something as opposed to seeing what an administrator does. Second, self-censorship isn't solved as easily as other forms of censorship. We can arrest people who steal, we can admonish people who overreach, and we can sue people who violate our rights. It's much harder to ferret out what causes certain people to self-censor, let alone what triggers that self-censorship. And finally, self-censorship needs to be involved as a large part of discussing censoring behavior going forward. Even if we can't solve it, like many other things that we have to discuss, perhaps acknowledging it and being aware of it, much like other issues we face on a societal level, we can be better with understanding it and dealing with its ramifications. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this my microphone that I should be pointing to here? If you're live streaming? Okay. Thanks to the hardy souls who are still here at the end of the day on Friday afternoon. I appreciate that. And I should also say thanks to the funders and donors who have made this event possible. You don't last very long in nonprofit land without being mindful of your donors. So we thank you for facilitating this event and allowing us to appear here. I am Frank Lomonte. I'm the director of the Student Press Law Center up in Washington, D.C. It's a nonprofit legal aid organization. The SPLC takes about 2,500 calls a year for assistance from people working in student journalism at the college and the high school level. And I'm going to share with you one of those calls. Michael Kelly was the faculty advisor to a student-produced newspaper at Fairmont State University in West Virginia. And Michael was a well-credentialed professional journalist who came to this job with the understanding that he would have 3 years to build a journalism program from scratch. In year one, Michael and his students produced a series of front-page articles investigating unhealthy conditions in campus housing. So unhealthy, in fact, that it resulted in the hospitalization of a student athlete who had inhaled unhealthy levels of toxic mold spores and was told by her doctor to immediately move out of the housing for her own health. These stories ran on the front page of the columns, the Fairmont State University newspaper. Immediately following the publication of the second of these two articles, Mr. Kelly received a terse 2-sentence email from the provost of the university indicating to him that his services were no longer required. The 3-year understanding became a 1-year and out termination. When the student editors then subsequently sat down and met with the provost and president at the Fairmont State University, they were all told that they were welcome to reapply for their jobs and to come back next fall as student editors, but that they would not receive serious consideration for those jobs because the newspaper was going to be taken in a more positive direction. These are the words of the president and provost. I feel certain that everyone in this audience is hearing that story today for the very first time. And the fact that you are, the fact that this is not a national scandal, the fact that this is not a national disgrace speaks to the routinization, the normalization of censorship on our campuses. The fact that that president, that provost still have their jobs and Michael Kelly does not speaks to the vaulting tolerance that we have for even the worst, most blatant, most remorseless abuses of press freedom on our college campuses at a time when press freedom matters more than ever for the reasons that John Peters explained to you. There is no more safety net for our communities. Professional news organizations are hemorrhaging 3,500 jobs every year. Who is picking up the slack increasingly? It is students or it is nobody at all. We can no longer count on the fact that if students do not bring us the stories when their campuses are unsafe or their educational programs are ineffective, that there will be a professional higher education reporter in that community who can bring us that story. It is the students or it is no one at all. I would invite you to think for a minute about what it means to be a community, because we speak of the college environment and the college campus as a community. And think about the ingredients, the civic building blocks of what goes into being a community. And you might think, well, certainly some sort of a shared set of interests, right? Maybe some kind of a legal system, a mechanism for enforcing the norms of behavior. Maybe some kind of an educational system for communicating those norms of behavior. But right up close to the top of what makes a community would be a method of transmitting news, right? There is a primal kind of a craving in people for news. Indeed, even when you imprison people, when you put them in correctional institutions and take away their freedom, one of the first things they do is start newspapers. They want to start newspapers and newsletters and transmit news among that community. because news is one of the things that binds us together as a society, and yet colleges increasingly are abdicating their responsibility to support that essential civic building block, even though colleges profess, sometimes ardently profess, to be in the business of civic engagement. There are colleges with entire offices, programs, vice presidents of civic engagement. And they are all about civic engagement when that means starting a website to raise money for hungry people in Darfur. That's civic engagement on the cheap. That's low impact civic engagement. There's no skin in the civic engagement game for those campuses. When students actually try to civically engage on their own campuses, that becomes uncomfortable for too many of our colleges, and those students are shut down. If you ask student journalists around the country, and I do, what is the biggest problem afflicting them? What's the biggest obstacle, impediment that they face in gathering and delivering the news to their communities? Censorship is certainly up there, but higher even than censorship on the list of concerns is what I call censorship by starvation. That is the increasing image-driven refusal of colleges to make information available to journalists so that they can then convey it to the public. I'm going to share with you a story that is going to sound to people today in today's college newsrooms like science fiction. It's a story from my own journalism experience as a college newspaper reporter at the University of Florida. At the University of Florida, not too many years ago, it was the president of the university's standard operating procedure on Monday morning to call a senior staff meeting with all the vice presidents, the provost, senior level staff around the conference table, and to open that meeting to the press so that journalists, myself included, could sit at that conference table with our notepads, and we could find out at the same time as the president of the university what was going on in the physical plant, in the academic affairs, in the student affairs, and every week you left with a notebook full of stories that you could bring back to your community. I will tell you now that if you try to get into that senior staff meeting, you will have to make a public records request to get a copy of the calendar to find out when the meeting is being held, which we will not be invited to. This is how, in one generation, the climate has changed on our campuses. And what is different is that colleges have become increasingly corporatized. The sense of colleges, and you heard at one of the previous panels, Professor Brett Johnson mentioned this idea of, which is nails on my First Amendment chalkboard, protecting the brand, as if colleges were Tide detergent. The impulse to protect the brand has led colleges to clamp down on access to information like never before, sometimes in exceedingly hostile and aggressive ways. And I'm just going to share with you two other stories. Again, stories that you'll be hearing for the first time today, even though these stories should have been national scandals. At Kent State University, the last time they went through a presidential search, the state law in Ohio entitles the public to see the records associated with a search for an executive position like the president. The journalist at the Kent State University newspaper, knowing their legal rights, served the university with a request for public records to see the notes and documents kept and circulated by the search committee so that they could inform the community before the choice was a done deal. The university responded to them over and over again, "We're working on this, we're working on this, give us more time, we need more time." At the end of the search committee process, when the president was selected, a finalist list of one, with the public still to this day not knowing who else was considered, the university then responded with a letter saying, "No responsive documents exist to your request." The reason, which wasn't in their letter, is that the members of the search committee had been told to shred all their documents upon the completion of the search. In order to undermine and end run the state public records law, the university destroyed all traces of the search. At Washington State University, earlier this year, state law in Washington entitles the public to access to the meeting at which the president of a college or university is hired, entitles the public to see the merits of the candidates deliberated in an open public forum. The Board of Trustees of Washington State University undermined this public accountability requirement by assigning secret code names to the candidates. Candidate A, Candidate B, Candidate C. One of the trustee members was sent behind a curtain to place a cell phone call to offer the job to Candidate C, unsurprisingly accepted, And to this day, no one knows who, other than the president of Kansas State University, who accepted the job, who was considered, what the credentials, qualifications were, whether any diverse candidates were considered. This is a white male, as are most of the selections. This is the attitude of defiance toward public accountability and disclosure on our college campuses. Outright, utter hostility and defiance. And you have to ask yourself culturally what this does to the culture of the college campus, what this does to that sense of community. I can tell you what it does. What it does is it creates a sense that the opinions of the students, the faculty, the employees are devalued, that the president answers to one and only one boss, and that is the board of trustees of the corporation. This results in a furtherance, a continuance of the climate of secrecy on our campuses, which undermines the ability of all citizens to have meaningful participation in these very powerful and influential government agencies. Is there a better way? Yes. I would submit that colleges and universities need to start thinking of their campus media in the way that they think of their own auditors. The auditor model is what I would suggest for college media, which is to say, every college commissions an audit with an independent auditing firm, and that independent auditing firm is valued for the independence of its judgment, right? Indeed, if the auditing firm came back year after year and said, we detect no problems, we find no shortcomings, your bill of health is perfectly clean, it would be a valueless audit, right? We pay for that audit to identify shortcomings so that we can fix them. This is the way colleges should think of journalism. No college, no reputable college, would think of interfering with the work of its auditors and trying to threaten, intimidate them into slanting their findings to be more favorable or more positive toward the college, nor should they do so with journalism. And just like with the auditor, colleges should recognize that the funding of journalism is not a frill, it is not the parsley on the plate, it is the meat and potatoes of a healthy civic community. One more word, and then I regret to say I am going to have to rush out to the airport as much as I'd like to visit with you folks. We didn't talk very much, and it would be an excellent topic for a future symposium about social media. But the governance of social media by our schools and our colleges today is something that I promise you we're going to look back in a generation and shake our heads and say, I cannot believe that anyone ever thought that way. There is a sort of collective societal freak out going on out there about the power of social media that is way, way disproportionate to reality, and that has resulted, not necessarily in the eyes of the law, but certainly on the ground in reality, that social media receives less protection than any other form of speech. And I'll give you a concrete example. At the University of Kansas system, the University of Kansas reacted to a controversial tweet posted by one of their professors by enacting a policy that governed all off-campus speech by all employees, faculty included. The policy, in a nutshell, said that if you say anything outside of the campus, outside of the workplace, that is contrary to the best interest of the university, that you forfeit any protection, and personnel action up to and including dismissal is on the table. Understandably and predictably, faculty in particular protested and pushed back. When they did so, the Kansas Board of Trustees amended the policy and said, oh, we don't care about other forms of off-campus speech. We only care about social media. And so today, there are two tiers of off-campus speech on the books in Kansas. There is the regular First Amendment that applies to speech in a newspaper article or in a television interview or in a speech to your local Board of Education or your city council. And then there is the reduced level that applies to speech on social media. And so the same comment that could be safely written in a letter to the editor in the state of Kansas can be grounds for firing if it is tweeted. We know that doctrinally this is not the law. We know that doctrinally there is no support for this, right? There is no support for the proposition that the effectiveness of your speech or the potential size of your audience diminishes your First Amendment protection. And yet that is the factual reality both for employees and for students on our campuses today. We need to have a sober, sensible conversation about that before, and I'll leave you with this. Many colleges today are tiptoeing through a minefield and someone is going to step on it. I had dinner the other night with a friend of mine who sits on the admissions committee for a pretty prestigious large public university, and he told me that when we have our admissions committee meetings to go over applications, if someone on the committee says, I looked at that student's social media accounts and I saw something that troubled me, that application goes into the reject pile. That application goes into the reject pile. We know that's not the law, but colleges have been tiptoeing through that minefield because so far nobody's been able to prove the cause and effect. That case is coming, and that day of reckoning is coming for our colleges. We have to get much more sensible about the way that we've been looking at social media and give students, yes, a safe space to talk about issues of social and political concern when they are off campus on their own time using their own devices. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you to all of our panelists. So the panel is originally slated to end at 4:20, but as we began a little later, if we can indulge, maybe we'll go until 4:30. I do have some questions, but I'm more interested really in engaging the audience in your questions. So does anybody have any questions for the panelists? I know Frank has to take off. Questions for the panelists? Yes?
Yes, on the issue of social media that you were just talking about, and a safe space, social media is unfiltered. You know, any individual can get on there and just put up whatever they want that can, offend other people. And then, other people don't have their safe space. It also touches on the issue of learning. People don't get that. But with the press, somebody can put up a newspaper, then the press filters it. And earlier they were talking about the press, has ethics, and they can decide what's newsworthy because they're professionals. Whereas individuals posting on social media don't have that.
Yeah, it's funny. I tell my students every time that they apply their craft, whether it's in the advanced type newsroom or on their own social media, you're a publisher, and you have to deal with the ramifications because free speech is not the same as consequence-free speech. There are things that will happen. But I know for a fact that a number of my students, when they get internships, they're 20, 21 years old, and a lot of people who are my age or older who are running the corporation say, I don't really understand that social media stuff, let's give it to the intern. Which is kind of like saying, we've got all these pilots in here to fly the 747, hey, somebody's baby's in the room, let's put them at the wheel and see what the heck happens. It's not a smart way to go about doing it because in a lot of cases, they're not thinking 3 steps ahead about the ramifications. So I think your point is very well taken that, you are playing with live ammo at that level, and you're almost more dangerous at the social media aspect because things can go viral so quickly than you are in a traditional print newspaper. I've said it before, I'm really grateful that the internet really wasn't around that much, and if people want to find out the stupid things I thought in college, they got to go back to the Daily Cardinal and dig through the bound volumes to find, me being dumb. I don't envy that for my students these days for sure.
Yeah, and I would just add to that maybe a contextual comment that social media are regulated legally, and then they are regulated extra legally by their own terms of service and terms of use. There are some requirements, for example, on different platforms that say in order to use this platform, you have to use your real name, you can't use a pseudonym, and your failure to do so could result in a suspension of your account or a termination of your account. So we've got what is amounting to kind of a de facto First Amendment jurisprudence that is developing around social media platforms as the platforms make their own rules, enforce their own rules, and in my view, do most of it without the level of public accountability that we have come to expect from courts when they make similar decisions. You can't go to Facebook, for example, and get a right of access to learn more about a decision that Facebook has made about content maybe of yours that Facebook has removed. So that's the expert legal side of it. The legal side, we have First Amendment rights in social media just as we do in any other form of media. But I would distinguish, and again, this isn't directly answering your question, but it's a bit of context that may help us understand better how social media come to be regulated. You've got primary forms of liability, you've got intermediary and secondary forms of liability. So if I were to go on to my Twitter feed and post a tweet that would be defamatory, one question that might be raised by the person whom I have defamed is, who can I sue? Can I sue you as the person who published the tweet? Can I sue Twitter as an intermediary? And statutorily, we decided about 20 years ago that the answer would be me. You would sue me for the defamation. The intermediary would be immune from that under most circumstances. The most circumstances part I mentioned because if it's intellectual property, that plays by a slightly different set of rules. If I were to post a piece of content that violates somebody's copyright, the copyright holder could sue both me as the publisher and could sue the intermediary for hosting that content if it fails to take it down after being notified.
Any questions?
Just quick, are there classes in journalism school regarding social media and really starting to think about this and teach the ethics of social media?
I can say that my classes do that. I haven't really looked around and done any kind of study or survey to get a sense of how other schools do it. Professor Johnson mentioned that one thing that he would like to see done here at the Missouri School of Journalism is to have a required undergraduate ethics class. I certainly would support that. I think that is a key component of any journalism or mass communication program. At the University of Kansas, we do have that in our journalism school. We've got in our core both mass comm law and mass comm ethics. I would think that the majority of accredited journalism programs would have both of those, but again, I'm not really sure on that.
Yeah, I know that Oshkosh goes through accreditation every year, and one of the things that they do focus on a lot is the issue of ethics. I know that every student that we have has to take a writing for the media course where ethics is a large component of that, and the social media courses that we do have, New and Emerging Media 1 and 2, are both rooted in that ethical framework. So I think the hard part at first is trying to get them to understand it. And then once they do, they become the converts who look at their friends saying, you can't do that, that's not. So we, for lack of a better word, we're creating kind of that apostle system of, we're trying to get you to understand it so you can explain it to other people. I think in a lot of cases, they have difficulty, and this is a common problem in digital, where understanding the difference between public and private. I'll give you, for instance, that fits with the web. Probably about 10, 12 years ago, I had a student who had her own website, and she put up this very derogatory commentary about a student who happened to be a young Republican on our campus. And so this student then grabbed that information, posted it to a bunch of conservative blogs and said, let this woman know what you think, this is what she thinks of you, let her know what you think of her. And she came into my office just whining like crazy, and she said, she can't do that. I said, why not? She said, well, that was private. And I said, you put it on the World Wide Web. What part of worldwide don't you get? She said, well, I just meant for my friends to see that. I said, I don't care what you meant. What you did is you put it out there for public consumption, and that is what happens. And I think in a lot of cases, I don't think about if I tweet something from this symposium, how it's going to bounce to my friend's account, to somebody else's account, to maybe to your account, and now you're hearing my thoughts, even though I didn't maybe think of that. It could be good, it could be bad, but at the end of the day, I'm not thinking 4 chess moves ahead, especially at the level in which our students are literally using Twitter to rant about things. And I think that's where a lot of our training tries to get them to understand. Again, like I know I repeat this, but you're playing with live ammunition. This is not a game.
Questions? One thing that I would like to ask Vincent and John is several of the panelists talk about some of the challenges to the student press. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on what you see as the principal challenge to the student press moving forward, whether legal, extra-legal, economic, whatever. And as you sort of survey these trends, are you optimistic or pessimistic, and is there cause for alarm?
You want to take a shot, or you want me to go first? Oh, okay. I'll give you time to think about it. Economics is always a big thing. I've been a fan of saying money isn't everything, but it beats the heck out of whatever comes in second. So when you have no money to do something, it makes it really difficult to do it. But I think the self-censorship issue that I brought up, I think, is one of the most critical ones, because we train students now to not ask a lot of questions. I think in a lot of cases, we tend to create a negative affect for them when they do. I tell my students right away in my writing classes that when I look over your shoulder and I ask you, why did you put that in your lead? A lot of their first responses is, oh, okay, I'll fix it. It's kind of like, the parental question, who left their socks on the floor? I have one daughter, they're about that big, and they're Hello Kitty socks. I know exactly who did it, but the question has that sense of accusation. For me, I think that when I ask why, I want an answer. I want them to understand it. So I think that for too long, they've been taught to self-censor. They've been taught to be fearful. They've been taught to worry. Am I optimistic or pessimistic? Well, I guess with the students that I have, I'm very optimistic, because I get a lot of first-generation college students at Oshkosh. I get a lot of veterans, 25-year-old students who've been shot at in 3 time zones. I get a lot of kids who have to convince their parents that don't run the New London bowling alley that college is worth it, because why, you're just going to come back and run the family business. So, I get a lot of kids who want it really badly. And because they want it that badly, it makes me want it for them. And I think that helps me to really kind of hypercharge their passion to become good, strong, inquisitive journalists as they move forward in whatever part of the field they do.
Yeah, and I guess if I were to add anything to that, it would simply be that if I look at this from a legal perspective, I think if we had a better understanding from both ends, on the part of the student press and on the part of the teachers, professors, administrators that we often paint as Darth Vader-like characters, who want nothing else other than to silence the student press. I think there are individuals like that. I don't know that that is wholly institutionalized within higher education any more than it is wholly institutionalized within K through 12 schools. I get a lot of phone calls, both as a scholar and as a lawyer, from people that I might consider as sitting on the other side of the desk from me. And it could be a teacher or a professor or an administrator who says, I feel like I have a First Amendment problem, and I'm not sure if I do, and if I do, what are some of the implications of these possible options that I have? Those types of conversations I have found incredibly rewarding to have, and I think it's great that these people are reaching out and they feel, I guess, comfortable enough in having that conversation and in admitting, at least impliedly, that I don't know the answer to this question. You have heard from Frank and from Vince that we had, our own set of First Amendment challenges in the last academic year at the University of Kansas. And we had the not full but partial defunding of our student newspaper, the Daily Kansan, which is one of the oldest and most prized university newspapers in the country. And I had a number of conversations behind closed doors with people, trying to help them understand what the rights are here, what the obligations are here, and how they intersect. So I guess for those reasons, I'm also optimistic that if we keep having these conversations and thinking about these problems, we're more likely to come out on the right side.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.